The emaciated stallion trembled in the auction ring, ribs protruding beneath a matted coat as potential buyers muttered worthless, and the slaughterhouse dealer raised his hand. Ethan's arm shot up in defiance, his meager savings account about to be emptied for a broken creature that everyone else had already condemned to death. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The rain fell in heavy sheets across Willow Creek Valley, transforming the dirt roads into muddy rivers and the pastures into soggy marshlands. It was the kind of relentless downpour that made even the most dedicated farmers seek shelter, abandoning their fields to the mercy of the elements. But for 23-year-old Ethan Marshall, the storm was the least of his worries. His battered pickup truck struggled along the flooded back road, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the torrent. The call he'd received from his uncle that morning had been urgent, and despite the weather, Ethan knew he couldn't delay. "There's trouble at the Blackwell auction," his uncle had said, his voice crackling through the poor connection. "They're selling off everything after old man Blackwell passed. There's a horse. You should come see." Ethan had never been particularly close to his uncle, a gruff man who managed the local animal shelter with more dedication than warmth. But there had been something in his voice that morning, a strain, an emotion Ethan rarely heard, that had him immediately reaching for his keys. As Ethan pulled into the makeshift parking area beside the Blackwell farm, his headlights swept across a scene of organized chaos. Despite the rain, a crowd had gathered. Farm equipment, household items, and livestock were being paraded and sold to the highest bidder. The auction had been moved into the large barn where people huddled together, their breath visible in the cold air as they waited for the next item to be presented. Ethan spotted his uncle standing at the far end of the barn, away from the main crowd. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders hunched forward as he stared into one of the back stalls. Ethan made his way through the crowd, nodding at familiar faces but not stopping to chat. When he reached his uncle, the older man acknowledged him with a simple nod. "You came," he said, as if surprised despite having made the call himself. "What's going on?" Ethan asked, shaking the rain from his jacket. His uncle didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the stall. "Look for yourself." Ethan stepped forward and peered over the wooden barrier. What he saw made his heart sink. In the corner of the stall, pressed against the wall as if trying to disappear, stood a horse, or what remained of one. The animal was painfully thin, its ribs and hip bones jutting out beneath a dull, matted coat. Its head hung low, nearly touching the ground, and its legs trembled visibly, struggling to support even its diminished weight. "Jesus," Ethan whispered, the word escaping him involuntarily. "They found him locked in the back pasture shed," his uncle explained, his voice low and tight. "Looks like Blackwell forgot about him after his stroke. Been there for months from what I can tell. No proper food, barely any water. The ranch hands found him when they were clearing the property for the auction." Ethan couldn't tear his eyes away from the horse. It was a stallion, he realized, though age and neglect had robbed it of any majesty. Its coat might once have been a rich bay, but now it was patchy and discolored. Scars crisscrossed its flanks, telling stories of past mistreatment even before the abandonment. "Why is he in the auction?" Ethan asked, anger creeping into his voice. "He needs a vet, not a new owner." His uncle shook his head. "Blackwell's son doesn't want to spend money on vet bills for a horse that might die anyway. He's selling him as is, probably for slaughter." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and terrible. Ethan had grown up around horses. His parents' modest farm had always had 2 or 3 horses grazing in the fields, and Ethan had learned to ride almost before he could walk. After his parents died in a car accident 5 years ago, Ethan had sold the horses along with most of the farm equipment. The memory of that day, Watching the trailer pull away with the animals he'd known his entire life still haunted him. "Next up," called the auctioneer, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd, "we have lot number 47, a stallion approximately 15 years old, being sold as is, no guarantees." A ranch hand approached the stall, rope in hand. The horse shrank back, eyes rolling in fear. When the hand entered the stall, the horse tried to rear but lacked the strength, stumbling sideways instead. The man cursed and roughly looped the rope around the horse's neck, dragging it forward. Ethan felt sick watching the animal struggle. As they led the horse to the auction block, its hooves slipped on the wet concrete, legs splaying awkwardly. The crowd parted, some with looks of pity, others with disgust. A few laughed, and the sound grated against Ethan's nerves like sandpaper. "We'll start the bidding at $50, the auctioneer announced, his tone noticeably less enthusiastic than it had been for previous lots. "Do I hear 50? The barn fell silent. The horse stood in the center of the crowd, head down, sides heaving with each labored breath. Rain dripped from the roof, creating small puddles on the concrete floor. "Come on, folks," the auctioneer tried again. $50. He's got some years left in him. Could be salvageable for something. A hand went up in the back. "50, called a man Ethan recognized as the owner of the local rendering plant. His stomach clenched. The man wasn't looking for a horse. He was looking for cheap meat. "We have 50. Do I hear 60? Silence again. The auctioneer sighed, raising his gavel. "Going once for 50. 100, Ethan called out, surprising himself as much as anyone. All eyes turned to him, including his uncle's, which had widened in shock. The rendering plant owner frowned. 150, he countered. Ethan stepped forward, closer to the horse. Up close, the animal looked even worse. Its eyes, once probably bright and alert, were dull and sunken. But as Ethan approached, the horse lifted its head slightly, nostrils flaring as it caught his scent. 200, Ethan said, not taking his eyes off the horse. 250. The man sounded annoyed now. The auctioneer looked between them, suddenly more interested in the proceedings. The rest of the crowd watched in silence, perhaps embarrassed by the spectacle or simply curious to see how high the bidding would go for such a wretched animal. 300, Ethan said firmly. The rendering plant owner stared at him for a long moment, then shrugged. All yours, he said, turning away with a dismissive wave. Sold for $300 to the young man in the green jacket, the auctioneer announced, bringing down his gavel with finality. As the reality of what he'd done sank in, Ethan felt his uncle's hand on his shoulder. You sure about this? The older man asked quietly. Ethan wasn't sure at all. He had just spent nearly all of his savings on a horse that might not survive the week. He had nowhere to keep it, no experience rehabilitating abused animals, and barely enough income from his construction job to support himself, let alone a horse. By any rational measure, he had just made a terrible decision. But as he looked at the horse, at the way it seemed to look back at him with something almost like recognition, Ethan felt a certainty settle over him. Yeah, he said, I'm sure. His uncle nodded slowly. Well, if you're going to do this, you'll need help. Come by the shelter tomorrow. We'll figure something out. Ethan approached the horse carefully, speaking in a low, gentle voice. Hey there, he said, extending his hand palm up. The horse flinched but didn't pull away. It's okay. You're safe now. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the barn, something fragile had begun to take shape. A connection, a promise, the first tentative thread of trust between a broken horse and a young man who, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, had decided to give it a second chance. The first night with the horse was the longest of Ethan's life. After the auction, he had managed to borrow a trailer from a reluctant neighbor, promising to return it by morning. Loading the horse had been a nightmare. The animal was too weak to climb the ramp on its own, and too terrified to trust Ethan's guidance. It had taken nearly an hour, with Ethan's uncle and 2 farmhands helping, to finally get the trembling stallion secured inside. The drive to Ethan's small property on the outskirts of town was slow and tense. Every bump in the road sent a jolt of worry through him, certain that the horse would lose its balance and injure itself further. When he finally pulled into his gravel driveway, the rain had subsided to a gentle drizzle, but darkness had fallen completely. Working by the headlights of his truck, Ethan had carefully unloaded the horse into the only shelter he had, a dilapidated tool shed that had come with the property. "It's just for tonight," he had promised the horse, spreading fresh straw on the dirt floor. "We'll figure something better tomorrow." Now, sitting on an upturned bucket in the corner of the shed, Ethan watched the horse by the weak light of a battery-powered lantern. The animal hadn't touched the water or feed he'd provided. It stood in the same position it had taken upon entering the shed, head low, eyes vacant, legs splayed slightly as if it might collapse at any moment. "You need to eat," Ethan said softly, more to break the silence than anything else. "Just a little, to keep your strength up." The horse's ear twitched at the sound of his voice, but otherwise it gave no indication that it had heard him. Ethan sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. What had he been thinking? He'd spent $300, money he couldn't afford to lose, on an animal that might be beyond saving. His small rental house came with 2 acres of overgrown land, but no proper stable, no fencing for a paddock, and certainly none of the specialized equipment or feed that a recovering horse would need. As if sensing his doubts, the horse shifted slightly, a pained sound escaping its throat. The noise snapped Ethan back to attention. This wasn't about him or his impulsive decision. It was about this living creature that needed help. "Okay," he said with renewed determination, "one step at a time." The next morning, Ethan awoke with a start, realizing he had dozed off on his uncomfortable perch. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the shed walls, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The horse had moved during the night, he noted with surprise. It now stood in the opposite corner, and, more encouragingly, the water bucket was half empty. "You drank," Ethan said, unable to keep the relief from his voice. "Good boy." He approached slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and his voice low. The horse watched him warily, but didn't try to move away. Up close in the daylight, Ethan could better assess its condition. The stallion's coat was worse than he'd initially thought. Patches were missing entirely, revealing skin raw with sores and old wounds. Its hooves were cracked and overgrown, and a thick crust of mud and manure had built up around its fetlocks. But it was the eyes that haunted Ethan the most, dark pools that seemed to hold years of pain and betrayal. "I'm going to help you," Ethan promised, "but you've got to work with me, okay?" After returning the borrowed trailer, Ethan drove straight to his uncle's animal shelter. Located on the edge of town, the modest facility primarily housed dogs and cats, but occasionally took in farm animals that had been rescued from neglect or abuse. His uncle was already waiting for him, a concerned frown creasing his weathered face. "How is he?" the older man asked without preamble. "Alive," Ethan replied. "But that's about all I can say for sure. I need your help, Uncle Jack. I don't know what I'm doing." Jack Marshall had never been an effusive man. After his sister, Ethan's mother, died, he had retreated further into himself, their relationship reduced to occasional phone calls and awkward holiday dinners. But horses were something Jack understood. Before running the shelter, he had worked as a ranch hand and later as a trainer for quarter horses. "Let me make some calls," Jack said. "I know a vet who owes me a favor, and we've got some supplies here you can take, proper feed, medicine for those sores, basic grooming tools." While his uncle made arrangements, Ethan wandered through the shelter, past kennels of barking dogs and rooms where cats lounged on scratching posts. At the back of the facility, a small paddock housed a pair of elderly ponies, rescued from a petting zoo that had gone bankrupt. They looked up as Ethan approached, ears pricked forward with interest. "Got more than you bargained for, didn't you?" said a voice behind him. Ethan turned to find a young woman watching him, arms crossed over her shelter volunteer t-shirt. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to assess him critically. "I guess so," Ethan admitted. "I'm Maya," she said. "I help out with the large animals when they come through. Your uncle says you bought a rescue case." "Not intentionally," Ethan said. "It just happened." Maya's expression softened slightly. "Those are usually the best kind of rescues, when it comes from the heart, not the head." She hesitated, then added, "I could stop by after my shift, take a look at him. I'm not a vet, but I've worked with rehabilitation cases before." Before Ethan could respond, his uncle returned. "Dr. Wyatt can come by your place at noon," he said. "In the meantime, let's load up some supplies. And Maya," he added, noticing the young woman, "I told her you might need an extra set of hands. She's good with the difficult cases." By the time Ethan returned home, the horse had eaten a small amount of the hay he'd left. It was a minor victory, but Ethan clung to it. The vet arrived precisely at noon, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with calloused hands and kind eyes. Dr. Wyatt spent nearly 2 hours examining the horse, her expression growing grimmer with each finding. "Severe malnutrition, obviously," she said, making notes on a clipboard. "Muscle atrophy, hoof neglect, parasites both internal and external. Some of these wounds are infected, and I'm concerned about his breathing. There might be respiratory issues as well." "But he can recover?" Ethan asked, trying to keep the desperation from his voice. Dr. Wyatt gave him a long look. "Possibly, with proper care, good nutrition, and a lot of patience, but I need to be honest with you. It's going to be expensive, time-consuming, and there's no guarantee he'll ever be fully sound. Some damage is permanent." Ethan looked at the horse, who had remained remarkably calm during the examination, as if too defeated to resist. "I want to try," he said firmly. The vet nodded, respect flickering in her eyes. "Then we'll start with the basics. First, does he have a name?" Ethan realized he hadn't even thought about a name. In his mind, the horse had simply been the horse or him. He studied the animal thoughtfully, taking in its broken body and wounded spirit. Despite everything, there was something in its posture, a stubbornness perhaps, or a will to survive, that hadn't been completely extinguished. "Phoenix," Ethan said suddenly. "His name is Phoenix." Dr. Wyatt smiled faintly. "Ambitious, but appropriate." She handed Ethan a detailed care plan and several prescriptions. "Start with these. I'll be back to check on him in 3 days." As the vet drove away, Ethan stood beside Phoenix, the weight of responsibility settling more firmly on his shoulders. He had just committed to weeks, maybe months, of intensive care, with no certainty of success. But looking at the horse, at the way it had already begun to respond to basic kindness, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope take root within him. "Phoenix," he said softly, testing the name. The horse's ear flicked toward him. "We've got a long road ahead of us, buddy, but we'll walk it together." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of exhaustion and small victories. Ethan quickly settled into a new routine, waking before dawn to tend to Phoenix before heading to his construction job, then rushing home during his lunch break to check on the horse and spending every evening administering medications, changing bandages, and coaxing the reluctant animal to eat. His social life, already limited, had vanished entirely, replaced by hours of research on equine rehabilitation and late-night worries about whether he was doing enough. Maya became a constant presence, stopping by almost daily to help with the more difficult aspects of Phoenix's care. Her experience proved invaluable, especially in the beginning when Phoenix would barely tolerate being touched. "You have to be patient but persistent," she explained one evening, demonstrating how to clean the infected sores on the horse's flanks without causing additional stress. "He needs to learn that human contact doesn't always mean pain." Phoenix seemed to respond better to Maya than to Ethan, which stung more than he cared to admit. The horse would stand relatively still for her ministrations, though his muscles remained tense and his eyes wary. When Ethan approached, Phoenix often retreated to the corner of the makeshift stall they had created in the shed, his fear palpable. "He associates men with abuse," Maya theorized, watching Ethan's frustrated attempts to gain the horse's trust. "It's not personal. Just keep showing up, keep being gentle. He'll come around." Uncle Jack had surprised Ethan by offering practical help as well. He had connections throughout the local farming community, and soon materials began appearing at Ethan's property. Fencing panels donated by a rancher upgrading his equipment, a used water trough from a farm that was downsizing, bags of specialized feed left anonymously in Ethan's driveway. Jack himself came by every few days, bringing supplies from the shelter and offering gruff advice. "You need to get him out of that shed," Jack said on his third visit, eyeing the cramped space critically. "Horse needs sunlight, room to move, even in his condition." Ethan had been reluctant, worried that Phoenix wasn't strong enough, but Dr. Wyatt agreed with Jack during her follow-up visit. "Controlled movement will help build his strength," she explained. "Just a small paddock at first, nothing too stimulating." So Ethan and Maya had spent a weekend setting up a modest enclosure beside the shed, using the donated panels to create a space about 30 feet square. Getting Phoenix to leave the shed that first day had been a monumental challenge. The horse had planted his feet at the doorway, trembling violently, his breathing rapid and shallow. "He's been confined for so long," Maya had murmured, her hand steady on Phoenix's neck. "Open space probably terrifies him now." It had taken nearly 2 hours of gentle coaxing before Phoenix finally took those first tentative steps into the paddock. The moment had been transformative. Ethan would never forget how the horse had lifted his head, nostrils flaring as he scented the fresh air, eyes widening as he took in the open sky above him. For just a moment, a glimpse of the magnificent animal he must have once been shown through the ravages of neglect. Now, 3 weeks into the rehabilitation, Phoenix was showing measurable improvement. His coat, though still patchy, had begun to regain some luster, thanks to a careful diet supplemented with oils and minerals. The worst of his sores had begun to heal, and he had gained enough weight that his ribs were no longer quite so prominent. Dr. Wyatt had trimmed his hooves during her last visit, explaining that they would need several more sessions before they returned to normal shape. Most importantly, Phoenix was beginning to respond to Ethan. The breakthrough had come on a rainy Tuesday evening. Ethan, exhausted after a particularly grueling day at the construction site, had slumped down on a hay bale in the shed, too tired to begin the usual care routine immediately. He had simply sat there, talking softly to Phoenix about his day, his worries, his hopes for the horse's recovery. "I don't even know if I'm doing this right," he had admitted, rubbing his sore shoulder. "I'm just making it up as I go along. But I'm trying, Phoenix. I'm really trying." Perhaps it was the defeated tone in his voice or the fact that he wasn't attempting to approach or touch the horse, but something had changed in that moment. Phoenix had slowly walked over to where Ethan sat and extended his neck, his muzzle hovering inches from Ethan's face. They had stayed like that for several heartbeats, breathing the same air, until Phoenix had gently, almost imperceptibly, pressed his nose against Ethan's cheek. The memory of that moment had sustained Ethan through the harder days that followed, when Phoenix would revert to fearful behavior or when the financial strain of the rescue began to weigh heavily. Ethan had taken on extra weekend work to cover the mounting veterinary bills and special feed, leaving him even more exhausted but determined to see Phoenix's rehabilitation through. On this particular evening, nearly a month after the auction, Ethan arrived home to find Maya already there, watching Phoenix graze in the paddock. The sight still amazed him. A horse that had been on death's door now strong enough to nibble at the sparse grass poking through the soil. "He's having a good day," Maya said as Ethan joined her at the fence. "Ate all his morning feed, and he's been exploring the paddock boundary, testing his limits." Ethan nodded, a smile tugging at his lips despite his fatigue. "Dr. Wyatt says we can start some light groundwork soon, just leading him around, getting him used to commands again." "That's great progress." Maya glanced at him, concern evident in her expression. "But you look terrible. When was the last time you had a full night's sleep?" "I'm fine," Ethan insisted, though the dark circles under his eyes told a different story. The truth was, he had been pushing himself to the breaking point, afraid that any lapse in Phoenix's care might undo the fragile progress they had made. Maya seemed about to argue, but she was interrupted by the arrival of Uncle Jack's pickup truck. The older man climbed out, accompanied by a stranger, a tall, lean individual with silver hair and an air of quiet authority. "Ethan," Jack called, waving him over, "there's someone I want you to meet." As they approached, Ethan could see that the stranger was older than he had first appeared, probably in his 70s, with deeply tanned skin that spoke of a lifetime outdoors. His eyes, keen and assessing, moved from Ethan to Phoenix with professional interest. "This is Daniel Blackwood," Jack said. "Used to run the biggest horse rescue in the state before he retired. He's agreed to take a look at your project." Daniel extended a weathered hand, his grip firm but not overpowering. "Jack's been telling me about what you've taken on," he said, his voice low and measured. "Quite a challenge for someone with no rehabilitation experience." Ethan bristled slightly at the implied criticism, but before he could respond, Daniel continued, "But sometimes it's the ones who don't know better who accomplish the impossible. Mind if I take a closer look at your boy there?" Ethan nodded, curious and a little apprehensive as Daniel approached the paddock fence. Phoenix, who had been grazing peacefully, immediately raised his head, ears pricked forward with interest rather than the fear Ethan had expected. Daniel made a soft clicking sound with his tongue, and to Ethan's astonishment, Phoenix walked directly to the fence, stretching his neck to sniff at the older man's outstretched hand. "Well, hello there, survivor," Daniel murmured, gently stroking Phoenix's forehead. "You've had quite a journey, haven't you?" The easy way Phoenix accepted Daniel's touch, something he still sometimes resisted from Ethan, was both impressive and slightly disheartening. Daniel seemed to sense this, glancing over his shoulder with understanding in his eyes. "Don't worry," he said. "Horses can tell when someone's spent a lifetime around them. It's not a reflection on your bond with him. And speaking of that bond..." He stepped back, gesturing for Ethan to approach. "Let's see what you two have built so far." Ethan hesitantly approached the fence, uncomfortably aware of Daniel's scrutiny. Phoenix's ears flicked back and forth, his posture tensing slightly as Ethan drew near. But when Ethan softly called his name, the horse took a tentative step forward, nostrils flaring as he caught Ethan's familiar scent. "Talk to him," Daniel instructed quietly. "Just like you normally would." Feeling self-conscious but determined, Ethan began to speak in the low, soothing tone he had developed during their evening sessions. "Hey, Phoenix, how's your day been? Looking good out here in the sunshine?" Gradually, Phoenix relaxed, eventually stretching his neck over the fence to nudge at Ethan's shoulder, the same gesture of tentative affection he had begun to show in recent days. Ethan reached up slowly, running his hand along Phoenix's jaw, marveling at how such a simple touch could still feel like a miracle after weeks of patient work. Daniel observed the interaction with careful attention, his expression revealing nothing. When Phoenix finally stepped back to resume grazing, the older man nodded thoughtfully. "He trusts you," he said. "Not completely, not yet, but the foundation is there. You've done well, considering your limitations." The backhanded compliment made Ethan bristle again, but Maya spoke before he could. "Ethan's been working non-stop," she said, a defensive edge in her voice. "Phoenix wouldn't be alive without him." Daniel's weathered face creased into a smile. "No need to get protective, young lady. I'm not criticizing. In fact, I'm impressed." He turned back to Ethan. Most experienced handlers would have given up on a case this severe, or worse, would have pushed too hard, too fast, doing more harm than good. You've shown patience, that's rare. Ethan felt his defensiveness ebbing away. "I've made plenty of mistakes," he admitted. "Mostly I've just been following Dr. Wyatt's instructions and hoping for the best. Well, your best has kept this horse alive and moving toward recovery." Daniel surveyed the modest paddock and the retrofitted shed, though your facilities leave something to be desired. Jack, who had been leaning against his truck watching the exchange, finally spoke up. "That's partly why I brought Daniel by. He's got a proposition for you." Daniel nodded, his expression turning serious. "Jack tells me you're working yourself into the ground trying to care for this horse while holding down a full-time job. And from what I can see, Phoenix is going to need more specialized care as his rehabilitation progresses." A cold knot of fear formed in Ethan's stomach. Was Daniel going to suggest that Phoenix would be better off with someone more experienced? The thought of giving up the horse now, after all they had been through together, was unbearable. "I have a small farm about 20 minutes outside town," Daniel continued. "Nothing fancy, but I've got proper stables, secure paddocks, and most importantly, experience rehabilitating cases like Phoenix. I'd like to offer you a partnership of sorts." "Partnership?" Ethan echoed, uncertain. "Phoenix comes to live at my place. You get full access, can visit any time, participate in his care, continue building your relationship with him. I'll provide the specialized facilities and guidance. You provide the dedication and bond you've already established. Together, we give this horse his best chance at a full recovery." Ethan struggled to process the offer. On one hand, it sounded too good to be true. Professional help for Phoenix without having to give him up entirely. On the other hand, Ethan had grown accustomed to being Phoenix's primary caretaker, to the daily routine of their interactions. The thought of someone else taking over, even someone as qualified as Daniel, left him feeling unexpectedly hollow. "I don't know," he said finally. "I've made a commitment to Phoenix. I can't just—" "No one's asking you to abandon him," Daniel interrupted gently. "Quite the opposite. I'm offering to help you fulfill that commitment in the best way possible. This isn't about taking over, it's about providing what Phoenix needs to fully recover." Maya, who had been listening intently, placed a hand on Ethan's arm. "It's worth considering, Ethan. You've been running yourself ragged, and Phoenix will need more space as he gets stronger." Ethan looked from Maya to his uncle, who gave a small nod of encouragement, then back to Phoenix, grazing peacefully in the paddock. The horse had come so far from the broken creature at the auction, but Ethan knew that true recovery would require resources and knowledge he simply didn't possess. "Can I think about it?" he asked finally. Daniel nodded. "Of course. Take your time, but not too much time," he added with a meaningful glance at Phoenix. "That horse is ready for the next phase of his rehabilitation. The sooner we start, the better his chances of making a full recovery." After Daniel and Jack departed, promising to return in a few days for Ethan's decision, Maya stayed to help with Phoenix's evening care. They worked in companionable silence, Maya applying salve to the healing sores on Phoenix's flanks, while Ethan prepared the special feed mixture that had been gradually restoring the horse's weight and strength. "You don't have to decide right away," Maya said finally, as they watched Phoenix eat. But Daniel's offer is generous. Places like his usually have long waiting lists. I know, Ethan sighed, leaning against the shed wall. Logically, it makes perfect sense. Phoenix would have proper facilities, expert care. It's obviously what's best for him. But, Maya prompted, sensing his hesitation. Ethan struggled to articulate the emotions churning inside him. It feels like giving up somehow, like I'm admitting I can't handle what I started. Maya's expression softened with understanding. That's not what this is, Ethan. You saved Phoenix's life. No one can take that away from you. But now you have to decide what's next for him, and for you. That night after Maya left, Ethan sat on the hay bale in Phoenix's shed, watching the horse's sides rise and fall with each breath. Phoenix had settled into a comfortable rhythm in the weeks since the auction. He knew when to expect Ethan, had begun to anticipate the routines of feeding and care, had even started to show small signs of personality emerging from beneath the layers of fear and trauma. "What do you think, buddy?" Ethan asked softly. "Would you like Daniel's fancy farm? Real stables instead of this drafty old shed?" Phoenix blinked drowsily, apparently content with his simple accommodations as long as they included regular meals and gentle handling. But Ethan knew that a horse's needs went beyond the basics of food and shelter. Phoenix needed professional rehabilitation if he was ever going to fully recover from the abuse he had suffered. The next morning, Ethan called in sick to work for the first time since starting his rehabilitation project. Instead of heading to the construction site, he drove the unfamiliar route to Daniel's farm, following the directions Jack had provided. He needed to see this place for himself, to understand exactly what Daniel was offering before he could make a decision. The gravel road wound through rolling hills, eventually opening onto a vista that made Ethan catch his breath. Daniel's small farm sprawled across at least 40 acres of lush pasture, dotted with oak trees and divided by white fencing into various paddocks and exercise areas. A modest but well-maintained barn stood at the center of the property, surrounded by smaller outbuildings and what appeared to be a covered arena for working horses in inclement weather. As Ethan pulled up to the main house, a single-story structure with a wide porch and rocking chairs facing the pastures, Daniel emerged, seeming unsurprised by the unannounced visit. "Thought you might come by," he said by way of greeting. "Want the tour?" For the next hour, Daniel showed Ethan around the property, explaining the purpose of each area and facility. There were special rehabilitation paddocks with soft, yielding ground for horses with hoof or leg injuries, isolation stalls for new arrivals or sick animals, a small medical room equipped for basic veterinary procedures, and spacious, airy stables with stalls twice the size of what Ethan had been able to provide in his converted shed. But what truly caught Ethan's attention were the horses. In various paddocks and enclosures, about a dozen horses of different breeds and sizes grazed, exercised, or simply basked in the morning sun. Some bore visible signs of past neglect or injury, a missing eye here, a pronounced limp there, but all seemed alert, well cared for, and remarkably at peace. "These are all rescues?" Ethan asked, watching a dappled gray mare with a badly scarred hind leg trot playfully around her paddock. Daniel nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. "Every one of them came here broken in some way, body, spirit, or both. Some stay permanently because their injuries make them unadoptable. Others eventually move on to new homes once they're fully rehabilitated." "And Phoenix? Which category would he fall into?" Daniel considered Ethan's question, his weathered face thoughtful as he gazed out over his pastures. "Too early to say for certain," he replied finally. "Phoenix has a long road ahead of him, but from what I've seen, he's got heart. That counts for a lot in rehabilitation." They continued walking, coming to a paddock where a chestnut gelding with a white blaze stood watching them intently. Unlike the other horses, this one showed no obvious signs of past trauma. His coat gleamed with health, and his muscular build spoke of proper care and conditioning. "This is Triumph," Daniel said, a note of particular pride in his voice. "My first rescue case after I retired from professional training." "He came to me much like your Phoenix, emaciated, terrified, barely alive." Ethan stared in disbelief. The magnificent animal before him bore no resemblance to the broken creature Daniel described. "How long did it take?" he asked, unable to keep the hope from his voice. "To get him looking like this?" "Nearly 2 years," Daniel answered honestly. "But the major physical recovery happened in the first 6 months. The rest was rebuilding his trust, retraining him, helping him remember what it means to be a horse instead of a victim." 2 years. The time frame staggered Ethan. He had been thinking in terms of weeks or months, not years. The reality of the commitment he had made when he purchased Phoenix at the auction suddenly felt far more substantial than he had initially understood. "I know what you're thinking," Daniel said, reading Ethan's expression. "It's a long haul. Most people aren't prepared for that kind of timeline when they rescue a horse." "I hadn't really thought that far ahead," Ethan admitted. "I just knew I couldn't let him go to slaughter." Daniel nodded, no judgment in his gaze. "That's how it starts for a lot of folks. A moment of compassion, an impulse to save a life. But rehabilitation is a marathon, not a sprint. It requires patience, consistency, and resources." He gestured toward the expansive property around them. "That's what I'm offering. A place where Phoenix can have the time and space he needs with people who understand the process." They completed the tour at the main barn, where Daniel showed Ethan the stall he had in mind for Phoenix. A corner space with extra padding on the floor and a small attached paddock for private turnout. It was easily 3 times the size of the converted shed where Phoenix currently resided, with better ventilation, proper drainage, and access to clean water through an automatic system. "This would be his home base," Daniel explained. "As he gets stronger, we'd gradually increase his turnout time and introduce him to the rehabilitation paddocks. Eventually, he might be able to join one of the small herds for socialization." The thought of Phoenix in such surroundings, receiving professional care and gradually rejoining the society of other horses was compelling. Ethan knew, with a certainty that was both painful and liberating, that he could never provide this level of rehabilitation on his own modest property, no matter how hard he worked or how much overtime he took on. "Your offer is incredibly generous," Ethan said finally. "But I have to ask, why? Why would you do this for a horse you've barely met and a person you don't know?" Daniel leaned against the stall door, his eyes distant as if looking into the past. "I've been where you are," he said simply. 30 years ago, I found a mare abandoned in a dried-up creek bed. So far gone, most people would have put her down on the spot. But something about her spoke to me, a fighting spirit beneath all that suffering. I was younger than you, with even fewer resources. I nearly killed myself trying to save her on my own." He fell silent for a moment, lost in memory. "An old trainer found me struggling and offered to help. No strings attached, no judgment for my inexperience. Just one horseman recognizing another's dedication and providing what was needed. That mare went on to become my first competitive dressage horse. Took me all the way to regional championships." A smile creased his weathered face. "She's buried under the big oak behind the house. Lived to be 31. The story settled between them, a bridge of understanding that crossed the gap of age and experience. Ethan realized that Daniel wasn't offering charity or passing judgment on his capabilities. He was extending the same hand that had once been extended to him. "I'd like to bring Phoenix here," Ethan said, the decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "If your offer still stands." Daniel nodded, satisfaction rather than triumph in his expression. It stands. When would you like to make the move? The transition happened more quickly than Ethan had anticipated. 2 days later, he found himself leading Phoenix up the ramp of Daniel's horse trailer, the horse showing surprisingly little resistance despite the echoes of his traumatic loading experience after the auction. Perhaps Phoenix somehow understood that this journey was different, that it led toward healing rather than further suffering. The unloading at Daniel's farm went even more smoothly. Phoenix stepped down the ramp with cautious curiosity, his nostrils flaring as he took in the unfamiliar scents of other horses, fresh hay, and the grassy pastures stretching around them. Daniel had prepared the corner stall exactly as promised, with thick bedding and a small meal waiting to help Phoenix associate the new space with positive experiences. "He's handling the change better than I expected," Daniel commented, as they watched Phoenix carefully explore his new accommodations, sniffing each corner and eyeing the automatic water system with suspicion. "He's come a long way from the auction," Ethan agreed, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in his chest. Logically, he knew this move was best for Phoenix, but emotionally, he felt a sense of loss he hadn't anticipated. For weeks, caring for Phoenix had been the center of his existence, the first thing he thought about in the morning and the last thing on his mind at night. Now, someone else would be overseeing that care, making decisions, monitoring progress. As if sensing his thoughts, Daniel placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "This isn't goodbye," he reminded him. "You're still part of his rehabilitation team. In fact, consistency from you will be crucial to his continued progress. I'm just providing the facilities and expertise to support what you've already started." Ethan nodded, grateful for the reassurance. "How often should I visit?" "As often as you can manage without exhausting yourself," Daniel replied. "Regular, predictable visits would be best. Horses thrive on routine. Maybe start with 3 or 4 times a week, then adjust as we see how he settles in." That evening, as Ethan prepared to leave, he found himself lingering in Phoenix's stall, reluctant to break their daily routine. The horse seemed relatively content in his new surroundings, having already consumed his special feed mixture and explored his attached paddock under Daniel's watchful eye. Now he stood quietly, his breathing steady, his eyes more alert than Ethan had seen them since the rescue. "I'll be back tomorrow," Ethan promised, reaching out to stroke Phoenix's neck. "This is a good place, buddy. Daniel's going to take great care of you." Phoenix nickered softly, pressing his muzzle against Ethan's chest in what had become his characteristic gesture of affection. In that moment, Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders, not the burden of responsibility, which he still carried willingly, but the crushing fear that he alone wasn't enough to save this horse. Here, with Daniel's expertise and proper facilities, Phoenix had a real chance at recovery. As Ethan drove home to his empty property, the converted shed standing silent and unused, he realized that in saving Phoenix, he had unwittingly embarked on a journey of his own. Where it would lead, he couldn't yet say, but for the first time in years, since the loss of his parents and the sale of their farm, he felt a sense of purpose taking root within him, fragile, but undeniably real. Autumn arrived in a blaze of color, transforming Daniel's farm into a canvas of reds, golds, and deep oranges. 2 months had passed since Phoenix's relocation, and the change in the horse was remarkable. His coat, once dull and patchy, now gleamed with health, covering the previously visible ribs and hip bones. The infected sores had healed, leaving only faint scars as reminders of his ordeal. His eyes, formerly vacant with despair, now watched the world with cautious interest. True to his word, Ethan visited regularly, settling into a pattern of evenings after work and longer sessions on weekends. At first, he had worried that Phoenix might feel abandoned or that their fragile bond would weaken with the separation. Instead, he found that Phoenix now greeted him with obvious recognition and what seemed almost like excitement. Ears pricked forward, a soft nicker of welcome, sometimes even a few eager steps toward the stall door when Ethan appeared. "He's looking for you before you even arrive," Daniel commented one Saturday morning as they watched Phoenix trot around the small exercise paddock, his movements still somewhat stiff, but growing more fluid with each passing week. "Starts getting restless about an hour before you usually show up. Horses have an incredible sense of time." The observation filled Ethan with a quiet pride. Despite his initial fears, the partnership with Daniel had strengthened rather than diminished his relationship with Phoenix. The arrangement had also allowed Ethan to learn from Daniel's extensive experience, absorbing lessons in equine psychology, rehabilitation techniques, and training methods that would have taken years to acquire on his own. Maya visited the farm almost as frequently as Ethan, her expertise with wound care proving valuable during the initial transition. Over time, her role had evolved from medical assistant to training partner, her natural affinity with horses complementing Daniel's more technical approach. The three of them had formed an unlikely team, united by their commitment to Phoenix's recovery. As Ethan and Daniel leaned against the paddock fence, Maya entered the enclosure with Phoenix, a halter and lead rope in hand. The training session today would focus on basic groundwork, teaching Phoenix to respond to gentle pressure, to move his feet on command, to trust human guidance after years of apparent abuse and neglect. "Watch his body language," Daniel instructed Ethan quietly. "See how his ears are slightly back but not pinned? He's concentrating, maybe a little apprehensive but not fearful or aggressive." Ethan nodded, studying Phoenix's responses as Maya slowly approached. The horse stood still, allowing her to slip the halter over his head and buckle it securely. This simple action, Ethan knew, represented weeks of patient desensitization work. In the beginning, even the sight of a halter had sent Phoenix into a panic, as if the equipment itself held memories of pain. Maya began leading Phoenix in a circle, using subtle cues from the lead rope and her body position to direct his movements. When he responded correctly, she immediately released the pressure, reinforcing the desired behavior. Phoenix followed her guidance with increasing confidence, his steps measured and deliberate. "He's getting it," Ethan said, unable to keep the excitement from his voice. Daniel nodded, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "He's a smart one. Once he understands what you're asking and realizes it won't hurt him, he's eager to comply. That tells me he was properly trained at some point before the abuse started." This matched Dr. Wyatt's assessment during her last visit. After examining Phoenix's teeth and overall conformation, she had estimated his age at around 9 years, younger than they had initially thought. "He's been through a lot in his relatively short life," she had commented, "but that youth may work in his favor for rehabilitation." Maya concluded the training session by asking Phoenix to yield his hindquarters, stepping away from pressure applied near his flank. When he executed the movement smoothly, she rewarded him with praise and a gentle stroke along his neck. The horse visibly relaxed, lowering his head and blowing softly through his nostrils. "Beautiful," Daniel called as Maya led Phoenix back toward them. "You've got a natural touch, young lady." Maya blushed slightly at the praise, handing the lead rope to Ethan. "He's the one doing all the work," she said, nodding toward Phoenix. "I'm just trying not to get in his way." As Ethan took the rope, his fingers brushed against Maya's, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met briefly before both looked away, suddenly interested in adjusting equipment or checking Phoenix's halter. Daniel observed the interaction with barely concealed amusement, but said nothing, turning instead to discuss the next phase of Phoenix's training schedule. The dynamic between Ethan and Maya had been shifting subtly over the weeks, their shared commitment to Phoenix creating a connection that extended beyond their initial roles as reluctant rescuer and experienced volunteer. They had begun meeting for coffee after particularly long training sessions, their conversations gradually expanding from Phoenix's progress to their own lives, dreams, and backgrounds. Ethan had learned that Maya was in her final year of veterinary technician training, her work at the shelter part of her practical experience requirements. She hoped eventually to specialize in equine rehabilitation, inspired by a childhood rescue much like Phoenix's that had shaped her career aspirations. In turn, he had shared stories of growing up on his parents' farm, the peace he had found working with horses, and the sense of loss that had followed him since selling the family property after their deaths. "You never thought about keeping the farm?" Maya had asked during one of these conversations. Ethan had stared into his coffee, the question stirring memories he usually kept carefully contained. "It wasn't financially viable," he'd explained. "Dad had taken out loans for equipment upgrades the year before the accident. Between the mortgage, the loan payments, and the everyday costs of running the place, I couldn't make the numbers work, not on my own." The decision to sell had been practical but painful, cutting him off from the life he had always expected to lead. Construction work paid the bills, but it never felt like more than a temporary solution, a holding pattern while he figured out what came next. Somehow, 5 years had passed in that pattern, until Phoenix had unexpectedly disrupted it. Now, as Ethan led Phoenix back to his stall after the training session, he felt a renewed sense of connection to that earlier self, the young man who had found peace and purpose working with horses. Phoenix snorted softly, nudging Ethan's shoulder in what had become a familiar gesture of affection. "You're looking good today, buddy," Ethan said, running a hand along the horse's gleaming neck. "Daniel says we might be able to start some light riding work soon. Would you like that?" Phoenix's ear flicked toward Ethan's voice, his dark eye regarding him with what seemed like consideration. The idea of eventually riding Phoenix had emerged gradually as his physical recovery progressed. Daniel had been cautiously optimistic, noting that Phoenix's conformation and movement suggested he had been a riding horse before his ordeal, and that returning to that work might actually benefit his muscular rehabilitation. "Nothing strenuous at first," Daniel had cautioned. "Just a saddle pad, then a light saddle. See how he reacts. If all goes well, maybe some weight in the stirrups, then short sessions with a rider." The prospect both excited and intimidated Ethan. His riding skills had grown rusty in the years since selling his parents' farm, and the responsibility of being Phoenix's first rider after such trauma felt enormous. Yet there was something undeniably right about the idea, a completion of the circle that had begun that rainy day at the auction. As Ethan settled Phoenix in his stall with fresh hay and water, Maya appeared in the doorway, her expression unusually serious. "Ethan," she said quietly, "there's something you should know. A man came by the shelter yesterday, asking about a bay stallion that was sold at the Blackwell auction. He said he was the original owner, before Blackwell got him." Ethan's hand stilled on Phoenix's neck, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. What did he want? "He said he's been looking for the horse for months. Apparently he sold him to Blackwell for breeding, but when he heard about Blackwell's death and the auction, he came back to try to find him." Maya hesitated. "He wants to buy him back, Ethan. He's offering a lot of money." Ethan's world seemed to tilt sideways, Maya's words echoing in his mind. Someone wanted to buy Phoenix back, the same Phoenix who had arrived at the auction half dead, the Phoenix who still flinched at sudden movements and bore the scars of profound neglect. The very idea was unthinkable. "Did he say his name?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Victor Harrington," Maya replied. "He owns a breeding operation about 100 miles north of here, specializes in performance horses." The name meant nothing to Ethan, but the mention of a breeding operation sent a chill through him. Phoenix's condition at the auction had spoken of profound mistreatment. Had it begun with this Harrington person before Blackwell acquired him? "What did your uncle tell him?" Ethan asked, referring to Jack, who still managed the shelter. That the horse had been purchased at the auction, and he couldn't disclose the buyer's information. Maya hesitated. But Harrington's persistent. He went to the auction house next and apparently got confirmation that a young man in a green jacket had purchased the stallion. He's been asking around town. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration and worry battling within him. Phoenix, sensing his agitation, shifted uneasily in his stall, moving away from the door where they stood. "Look what you've done with just a raised voice," Daniel said quietly, joining them from the barn aisle. "Imagine what being returned to someone who may have contributed to his condition would do." "You heard?" Maya asked. Daniel nodded grimly. "Every word. And it's not the first time I've encountered Victor Harrington. His breeding operation has a reputation, not a good one. High turnover of horses, rumors of harsh training methods." He shook his head. "The kind of place where results matter more than welfare." The confirmation of his fears sent a surge of protectiveness through Ethan. "He's not getting Phoenix back," he stated flatly. "I don't care how much money he's offering." "It may not be that simple," Daniel cautioned. "If Harrington can prove prior ownership and argue that Blackwell sold the horse without proper authority, he might have a legal claim." "That's ridiculous," Maya protested. "Phoenix was legally sold at a public auction after Blackwell's death. Ethan has the paperwork. And we have documented evidence of the condition Phoenix was in when purchased," Daniel added thoughtfully. Dr. Wyatt's initial examination notes, photographs, the treatment records. If Harrington was the owner before Blackwell, he'd have a hard time explaining how the horse ended up in such a state. Relief flooded through Ethan at Daniel's words. Of course, they had evidence, documentation of Phoenix's journey from the broken creature at the auction to the gradually recovering horse he was today. Surely that would count for something if Harrington tried to pursue a legal claim. "So what do we do?" Ethan asked, unconsciously moving closer to Phoenix's stall, as if his physical presence could protect the horse from this new threat. "For now, we document everything even more carefully," Daniel advised. "Every training session, every veterinary visit, every milestone in his recovery. We build a case that shows the horse is thriving in his current situation and that a change of ownership would be detrimental to his welfare." Maya nodded, her expression resolute. "I'll talk to Dr. Wyatt, get formal statements about his condition when she first examined him and his progress since. And I'll check with my friend who's in law school. She might know something about animal ownership cases like this." Their immediate support steadied Ethan, anchoring him against the wave of anxiety that had threatened to overwhelm him. Phoenix wasn't just his responsibility anymore. He had allies, people who understood the stakes and were committed to protecting the horse they had all come to care for deeply. "Thank you," he said simply, looking from Maya to Daniel with gratitude. Daniel clasped his shoulder briefly. "Phoenix is part of this farm now, part of our rehabilitation program. I don't let my horses go back to situations where they'll suffer. Harrington will have to go through me too, not just you." The following days passed in a haze of heightened vigilance and increased documentation. Maya took new photographs of Phoenix, highlighting both his improved condition and the remaining evidence of past trauma. Dr. Wyatt provided a detailed statement about his initial state and ongoing recovery, explicitly noting that in her professional opinion, returning him to his previous environment would pose a significant risk to his physical and psychological well-being. Daniel, drawing on his network of contacts in the equestrian community, quietly gathered information about Harrington's operation. The reports confirmed his earlier assessment. While not overtly abusive enough to attract legal attention, Harrington's facility had a pattern of pushing horses beyond their limits, discarding those that didn't meet expectations, and employing training methods that prioritized quick results over the animal's long-term welfare. Throughout it all, they continued Phoenix's rehabilitation as planned, determined not to let the threat of Harrington's claim disrupt the horse's progress. If anything, their work took on a new urgency, each successful training session and physical improvement strengthening their case for keeping him where he was. One crisp October afternoon, as Ethan worked with Phoenix on ground tying, teaching him to remain stationary when the lead rope was dropped to the ground, Daniel approached with an unusually serious expression. "He's here," Daniel said without preamble. "Harrington just pulled up to the house." Ethan's hand stilled on Phoenix's halter, his heart rate accelerating. "Here? Now?" Daniel nodded. "Says he wants to discuss the situation like gentlemen. I told him to wait by the front paddock. Thought you should be there for the conversation." Ethan glanced at Phoenix, who stood calmly under his touch, unaware of the storm gathering around him. "I should put him back in his stall first." "No," Daniel said thoughtfully. "Bring him. I want Harrington to see exactly what we've accomplished with this horse, how far he's come under proper care." With Phoenix walking quietly beside him on a loose lead rope, Ethan followed Daniel toward the front of the property, each step strengthening his resolve. Whatever Harrington might say or offer, Ethan would not waver. Phoenix deserved better than to be treated as a commodity, passed from one owner to another without consideration for his welfare. As they rounded the corner of the barn, Ethan caught his first glimpse of Victor Harrington, a tall, imposing figure in his 50s, dressed in expensive riding clothes and polished boots that had clearly never seen real barn work. He stood with his back straight, hands clasped behind him, surveying Daniel's modest facility with an expression that mingled appraisal and disdain. When he turned at their approach, his gaze immediately locked onto Phoenix, a flash of recognition crossing his features. "There he is," Harrington said, his voice smooth and cultured. "Midnight Commander. One of my most promising breeding prospects before that fool Blackwell mismanaged him." Midnight Commander. The formal name struck Ethan as wrong somehow, incongruous with the gentle soul he had come to know as Phoenix. It belonged to a different horse, one valued for pedigree and performance potential rather than his resilient spirit and trusting heart. Phoenix, for his part, had gone rigid at the sound of Harrington's voice, his ears pinned back flat against his head, nostrils flaring with what could only be described as recognition and fear. The transformation was immediate and undeniable, from the calm, increasingly confident horse of moments ago to a tense, ready-to-flee animal. "Interesting reaction," Daniel observed quietly, his gaze moving between Phoenix and Harrington. "Horses don't forget, Mr. Harrington, and from what I can see, yours remembers you quite clearly." Harrington's expression hardened at Daniel's pointed observation, but he quickly recovered, a practiced smile replacing the momentary flash of annoyance. "Animals pick up on human tension," he said dismissively. "You're all clearly uncomfortable with my presence, and the horse is responding to that." Ethan felt Phoenix trembling beside him, the horse's body so taut it seemed he might bolt at any second. Instinctively, Ethan stepped between Phoenix and Harrington, creating a physical barrier while keeping his voice low and steady. "It's okay, buddy. You're safe. I promise." Harrington watched the interaction with calculating eyes. "You've formed quite an attachment to my horse," he remarked, emphasizing the possessive. "Commendable, but ultimately beside the point. Midnight Commander represents a significant investment, superior bloodlines, championship potential. He belongs in a professional breeding program, not a—" He gestured vaguely at Daniel's farm. "Retirement facility." "This is a rehabilitation center," Daniel corrected, his tone mild but firm. "And Phoenix, that's what we call him now, was near death when Ethan purchased him at auction. Hardly the condition a valuable breeding prospect should be in, wouldn't you agree?" A flicker of unease crossed Harrington's face before he schooled his features again. "An unfortunate situation," he conceded. Blackwell assured me he could handle a spirited stallion. Obviously, he was mistaken. When I learned of his death and the subsequent auction, I immediately began searching for the horse. It's taken me months to track him here. You're saying you sold him to Blackwell in good condition? Ethan asked, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. Of course, Harrington replied smoothly. He was in peak physical form, perhaps a bit headstrong, in need of experienced handling, but certainly not in poor health. Whatever happened afterward was Blackwell's doing, not mine. Phoenix had begun to settle slightly under Ethan's reassuring touch, but his eyes remained fixed on Harrington, tracking his every movement with unmistakable wariness. The horse's reaction spoke volumes, contradicting Harrington's carefully constructed narrative. "Here's what I propose," Harrington continued, reaching into his jacket to withdraw a checkbook. "I'll compensate you generously for your time and expenses. Say, $5,000? That's far more than you paid at auction, plus ample coverage for any rehabilitation costs you've incurred. Everyone wins. You make a tidy profit, and I recover my valuable breeding prospect." The sum, more money than Ethan had in his bank account, hung in the air between them. $5,000 would clear his remaining credit card debt from Phoenix's early veterinary bills and leave enough to make a significant dent in his student loans. It was a tempting offer, viewed purely in financial terms. But as Ethan looked at Phoenix, at the trusting relationship they had built from the ruins of abuse and neglect, he knew no amount of money could compensate for betraying that trust. "He's not for sale," Ethan said firmly. "At any price." Harrington's facade of geniality slipped further, his mouth tightening into a hard line. "Don't be foolish, young man. You're clearly not equipped to maximize this horse's potential. He's wasted here when he could be producing championship offspring at my facility." "Producing offspring requires a level of health and soundness that Phoenix may never fully regain," Daniel interjected. "Dr. Wyatt's assessment indicates permanent damage to his respiratory system and possibly his reproductive capability, likely from prolonged malnutrition and inadequate shelter." This information, which Ethan hadn't heard before, seemed to give Harrington pause. His eyes narrowed as he reassessed Phoenix more critically, perhaps seeing for the first time the lingering signs of trauma beneath the improving exterior. "If that's true, then his value is significantly diminished," Harrington muttered almost to himself. Still, with his bloodlines, even as just a pasture ornament for potential buyers to see. "He's not a commodity," Ethan interrupted, anger flaring at Harrington's callous assessment. "He's a living being who's suffered enough. I purchased him legally. I've invested months in his rehabilitation, and I have no intention of selling him, especially not to someone he's clearly terrified of." Harrington's expression darkened. "Watch your implications, young man. I've never abused an animal in my life. I run a professional operation with exacting standards. Exacting standards that somehow led this horse to develop a fear response so profound he still flinches at sudden movements months later." Maya's voice cut through the tension as she approached from the barn, a folder of documents clutched in her hands. "I've just been reviewing Phoenix's medical records with Dr. Wyatt. The pattern of old injuries suggests long-term mistreatment, not a few months of neglect under Blackwell." Harrington turned his cold gaze on Maya. "And you are?" "Someone who's documented every stage of Phoenix's recovery," she replied evenly, opening the folder to reveal photographs, veterinary reports, and training logs. Including his condition when purchased: emaciated, covered in infected wounds, respiratory distress, signs of physical abuse including whip marks and spur injuries. She handed several particularly graphic photographs to Harrington, who took them with visible reluctance. "These were taken the day after the auction," Maya continued. "Dr. Wyatt's professional opinion is that this level of deterioration represents months of progressive neglect and mistreatment, not weeks. That timeline overlaps with when you claim he was still in your care before being sold to Blackwell. Harrington's face flushed as he thrust the photographs back at Maya. This proves nothing. Blackwell could have. We've spoken with Blackwell's son, Daniel interrupted calmly. He confirms his father purchased the horse only 3 weeks before suffering his stroke. The condition documented here couldn't have developed that quickly. And several of the older injuries, particularly the pattern of spur marks, are consistent with techniques I've heard associated with your training program, Mr. Harrington. The accusation hung in the air, damning in its specificity. Harrington looked from Daniel to Maya to Ethan, assessing his opposition with new wariness. Whatever he saw in their united front seemed to give him pause. "I could pursue this legally," he said finally, his tone shifting from demanding to almost bargaining. "I have paperwork proving prior ownership, registration documents, bills of sale. And we have evidence of abuse dating to the period of your ownership," Daniel countered. "Evidence we'd be obligated to share with the State Veterinary Board and animal welfare authorities if this goes to court. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny on your operation, Mr. Harrington?" The implied threat struck home. Harrington's confident posture faltered visibly, his gaze sliding away from their direct stares. "Perhaps we've gotten off on the wrong foot," he said, abruptly changing tactics. "I can see the horse is in adequate hands for his current needs. Maybe a partnership arrangement would satisfy everyone. You continue his rehabilitation, and when he's recovered sufficiently, he comes to my facility for limited breeding purposes. I'd compensate you, of course." "No," Ethan said simply. "No deals, no partnerships, no breeding. Phoenix stays here with people who care about his well-being, not his economic value." Harrington looked at Phoenix one last time, calculation evident in his expression. Whatever equations he was running, potential profit versus potential legal and reputation damage, seemed to resolve themselves in a direction he didn't like. "This isn't over," he said finally, tucking his unused checkbook back into his jacket. "That horse represents a significant investment. I don't abandon investments easily." "And Phoenix isn't just a horse to us," Ethan replied, his hand steady on Phoenix's neck. "He's family. We don't abandon family either." Harrington turned and walked stiffly back to his luxury SUV, the gravel crunching under his polished boots. They watched in silence as he drove away, dust billowing behind his vehicle. Only when Harrington had disappeared down the long driveway did Phoenix finally relax, his head lowering as he released a deep breath that seemed to carry away months of buried fear. "Good boy," Ethan murmured, stroking the horse's neck. "He's gone. You're safe." But even as he spoke the reassurance, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Harrington's threat, "This isn't over," was more than just the empty words of a frustrated man. Something in his calculating gaze had suggested a person accustomed to getting his way, eventually, by whatever means necessary. Harrington's threat lingered like a storm cloud over the farm in the days that followed, casting a shadow on what should have been a period of celebration. Phoenix had reached several important milestones in his rehabilitation, accepting a saddle without fear, carrying light weight in the stirrups, and even taking his first tentative steps under a rider as Daniel sat on him for just a few moments in the round pen. These achievements, which would normally have been marked with quiet triumph, now carried an undercurrent of urgency, as if they were racing against an invisible deadline. "We need to be prepared," Daniel advised one evening as they sat around his kitchen table, mugs of coffee growing cold as they discussed Harrington's potential next moves. "Men like him don't walk away when they're denied something they want. Maya's friend in law school thinks we have a strong case if he tries to claim ownership," Ethan said, shuffling through the notes he'd taken during their conversation. "The auction was legal and the documented abuse provides additional protection. Courts generally won't return an animal to a situation where there's evidence of mistreatment." Courts also tend to view horses as property, not family members, Daniel countered gently. And Harrington has resources we don't. Expensive lawyers, connections in the industry, time to drag out proceedings. Maya, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. I think we need to consider that he might not stick to legal channels. My uncle mentioned that someone's been asking questions at the shelter about our schedules when we're typically here at the farm. The implication hung heavy in the air. If Harrington couldn't regain Phoenix through legal means, might he resort to simply taking him? The thought sent a chill through Ethan, memories of the horse's reaction to Harrington's presence still fresh in his mind. We'll increase security, Daniel decided, his weathered face set with determination. Motion-activated lights near the barns, locks on all the gates, maybe a camera system. I've been meaning to upgrade anyway. I can stay in the spare room above the stable, Ethan offered immediately, at least until we're sure Harrington's given up. Maya nodded her agreement. And I can adjust my shelter hours to be here when Ethan's at work. Between the three of us, we can make sure Phoenix is never alone. The plan was implemented that very night, with Ethan moving a sleeping bag and basic necessities into the small room above Daniel's stable. It was sparsely furnished, just a narrow bed, a nightstand, and a desk beneath a window that overlooked the main paddocks. But it offered a clear view of Phoenix's stall and the surrounding grounds. The night watch quickly became part of their routine. Ethan would arrive after his construction shift, relieving Maya, who had been there since morning. Then Daniel would take over the early dawn hours before heading to his regular farm tasks. Between them, they ensured that Phoenix was under constant supervision, his routine continuing uninterrupted despite the shadow of Harrington's threat. As days stretched into weeks with no sign of Harrington, some of the tension began to ease. Phoenix continued to progress, his body filling out and his confidence growing steadily. The groundwork with Maya had developed into more complex training, with Phoenix now responding to subtle cues and showing increasing trust in his handlers. The most significant breakthrough came on a crisp November morning, frost glittering on the grass as Ethan led Phoenix into the round pen for what had become their daily session. Daniel, watching from the fence, had suggested it was time for Ethan to try sitting on Phoenix, just briefly, with no expectations beyond the horse accepting his weight. "Are you sure he's ready?" Ethan asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "What if he panics?" Daniel's eyes crinkled with understanding. "He might, but you've built enough trust that he'll recover from it. The question is, are you ready?" The truth was complex. Ethan had been both anticipating and dreading this moment, wanting to experience that connection with Phoenix, but terrified of pushing too hard and undoing months of careful rehabilitation. The responsibility weighed heavily, especially knowing that Phoenix's previous experiences under saddle had likely been sources of fear and pain. "I think so," Ethan said finally, taking a deep breath to steady himself. With Daniel's guidance, they prepared Phoenix with meticulous care. A familiar saddle pad, the lightweight saddle he had grown accustomed to, careful tightening of the girth with pauses to let him adjust. Throughout the process, Phoenix remained calm, his ears flickering back occasionally to track Ethan's movements but showing none of the anxiety they had anticipated. "Talk to him," Daniel advised as Ethan prepared to mount. "Let him know it's you, not a stranger." Ethan stood beside Phoenix, one hand on the saddle, the other stroking the horse's neck as he murmured reassurances. "It's just me, buddy. Nothing to worry about. We'll take it slow." With a final nod from Daniel, Ethan placed his foot in the stirrup and slowly, carefully raised himself up. Phoenix tensed momentarily, his back hollowing slightly as he felt the unfamiliar weight, but he didn't move away. Encouraged, Ethan swung his leg over and settled gently into the saddle, keeping his weight light and his movements minimal. For a breathless moment, Horse and rider remained frozen in place. Ethan barely daring to breathe, Phoenix standing motionless beneath him. Then, with an audible exhale, Phoenix relaxed, his back softening and his head lowering slightly in acceptance. "Perfect," Daniel said quietly from the fence. "Just sit there for a minute, let him get used to you, then we'll end on that good note." The minutes stretched like an eternity, filled with a silent communication flowing between Ethan and Phoenix. He could feel the horse's breathing, the subtle shifts of his body, the remarkable strength contained within the frame that had once been so frail. It was a moment of profound connection, of trust given and received, of promises kept and new ones forming. When Daniel finally signaled that it was time to dismount, Ethan did so with reluctance, already missing the unique perspective from Phoenix's back. As his feet touched the ground, he turned to find himself facing Maya, who had arrived unnoticed during the session. "That was beautiful," she said, her eyes suspiciously bright. "I wish I had a camera." The three of them stood in companionable silence, watching Phoenix relax and process this new experience. The fear that had haunted his eyes at the auction seemed a distant memory now, replaced by a cautious confidence that grew stronger each day. Their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of tires on gravel, a vehicle approaching too quickly for the narrow farm lane. Daniel frowned, moving toward the round pen gate. "Were we expecting anyone?" Before either Ethan or Maya could respond, a sleek black SUV pulled into view, followed by a horse trailer emblazoned with the Harrington Stables logo. Victor Harrington emerged from the driver's seat, accompanied by two men whose muscular builds and alert postures suggested they weren't there for a social visit. "Mr. Marshall," Harrington called, his voice carrying across the yard. "I've decided to stop playing games. I have a court order here." He waved a document with an official-looking seal, granting me temporary custody of Midnight Commander pending a full ownership hearing. I'll be taking him now. Ethan instinctively moved closer to Phoenix, who had gone rigid at the sound of Harrington's voice. "That's impossible," he said, though doubt and fear crept into his tone. "There's been no hearing, no notification." "Emergency ex parte order," Harrington replied with a cold smile. "Based on my documented ownership history and concerns about the horse's current welfare, rather convincing photographs of what appeared to be recent injuries." The judge was most sympathetic. Daniel stepped forward, his expression hardening as he took in the situation. "Let me see that order." As Daniel examined the document, Maya moved to Ethan's side, her voice low and urgent. "Those men with him. I recognize one from the shelter. He was asking questions about the farm layout last week. Claimed he was interested in volunteering." The realization struck Ethan with sickening clarity. Harrington had been planning this, gathering information, preparing to take Phoenix by force if necessary. The court order, whether legitimate or not, was just his attempt to give the seizure a veneer of legality. "This looks official," Daniel admitted reluctantly, returning the document. "But I'm calling our lawyer before anyone takes any horse off this property." Harrington's smile didn't reach his eyes. "By all means, make your call. But my men will be loading Midnight Commander while you do. The order is quite clear: immediate surrender of the animal." Time seemed to slow as Harrington's men started toward the round pen, their purposeful strides carrying the weight of inevitable confrontation. Phoenix, sensing the tension, began to circle nervously behind Ethan, his newfound confidence visibly crumbling in the presence of his former owner. Ethan's mind raced through their options, none of them good. Physically resisting would be dangerous and possibly illegal if Harrington truly had a court order. Letting them take Phoenix was unthinkable. Every instinct screamed at him to protect the horse who had come to trust him, who had fought so hard to recover from the very trauma these men had likely inflicted. "Wait," Maya called suddenly, stepping forward with her phone raised. Before anyone does anything, you should know I'm recording this entire interaction. And I've just sent a message to Dr. Wyatt, who's on her way with the county animal welfare officer." Harrington's expression flickered, the first hint of uncertainty crossing his features. "This is a legal matter between Mr. Marshall and myself. Outside parties have no standing." "Actually," Daniel interjected, his own phone now in hand, "as Phoenix's rehabilitation facility and current housing provider, we have every right to ensure his welfare during any transfer. And my lawyer, who I've just texted, advises that we're entitled to a 24-hour notice period before execution of any custody order involving a rescue animal under professional rehabilitation." It was a bluff, at least Ethan thought it might be, but delivered with such conviction that Harrington hesitated, glancing back at his men with a barely perceptible nod that halted their advance. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the unexpected arrival of a third vehicle, Uncle Jack's familiar pickup truck, kicking up dust as it rumbled down the driveway at alarming speed. It screeched to a halt beside Harrington's SUV, and Jack emerged with surprising agility for a man his age, accompanied by a uniformed sheriff's deputy and a woman in a business suit carrying a leather portfolio. "Perfect timing," Jack called out, his usually gruff voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Found these folks at the shelter looking for all of you. Figured I'd give them a ride." The deputy approached Harrington, his expression professionally neutral. "Mr. Harrington, I'm Deputy Collins. We've received some concerning information about potentially fraudulent court documents being used to seize property in this county." "My court order is perfectly legitimate," Harrington insisted, though his confident demeanor had begun to fray at the edges. The woman in the suit stepped forward. "I'm Angela Reeves, County Prosecutor's Office. May I see this order, please?" Harrington reluctantly handed over the document, his jaw tightening as she examined it closely. "This appears to bear Judge Michael's signature," she said after a moment, "which is interesting, considering Judge Michaels is currently on vacation in Europe and hasn't signed any orders in over a week." She looked up, her gaze steely. "Where exactly did you obtain this document, Mr. Harrington?" The color drained from Harrington's face, but he maintained his composure. "There must be some mistake. My attorney assured me." "We can discuss the details at the station," Deputy Collins interrupted. "In the meantime, I'll need to confiscate this document as evidence." He turned to his car radio, requesting additional units. What followed was a blur of activity. Harrington's increasingly desperate attempts to explain away the fraudulent order, the arrival of more deputies, the formal reading of rights as Harrington was informed he was being detained for questioning regarding document fraud and attempted theft. Through it all, Ethan remained beside Phoenix, one hand steady on the horse's neck, murmuring reassurances as the chaos unfolded around them. The horse trembled beneath his touch, but didn't bolt, his trust in Ethan apparently stronger than his fear of Harrington. As the authorities led Harrington and his men away, Angela Reeves approached Ethan with a tired smile. "You can thank Maya for this," she said, nodding toward the young woman who stood nearby. "She contacted our office yesterday with concerns about Mr. Harrington's threats and his reputation in the equestrian community. We've apparently had several complaints about his operation over the years, but never enough evidence to justify an investigation." "Until now," Maya added, relief evident in her voice. "His attempt to use fraudulent court documents gives us the legal grounds to look more closely at his entire operation." The implications settled over Ethan slowly. Not only was Phoenix safe for now, but Harrington's actions might finally bring scrutiny to the breeding facility that had likely mistreated countless horses before him. In the days that followed, the full story emerged in pieces. Harrington's financial troubles had driven him to increasingly desperate measures to maintain his breeding operation's prestigious facade. Phoenix, or Midnight Commander, had been one of his most valuable breeding stallions, sold to Blackwell only when mounting debts forced Harrington to liquidate assets. When Blackwell died and the horse disappeared, Harrington had become obsessed with recovering what he saw as his ticket back to solvency. The fraudulent court order was just his final ill-conceived attempt to reclaim what he believed he was entitled to, regardless of the horse's welfare or legal ownership. Now, as winter settled over Daniel's farm, bringing crisp mornings and early sunsets, Phoenix's rehabilitation continued uninterrupted. The threat of Harrington had faded, his breeding operation under investigation, his reputation in tatters. His focus necessarily shifted to his own legal troubles rather than reclaiming a single horse. On this particular morning, 3 months after the auction that had brought Phoenix into Ethan's life, horse and rider moved together across the frost-covered pasture, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Phoenix's stride was confident now, his once emaciated frame filled out with healthy muscle, his coat gleaming in the winter sunlight. The physical scars remained, but the fear in his eyes had been replaced by a calm trust that deepened with each passing day. From the fence, Maya and Daniel watched the pair's easy harmony with matching smiles. "I never thought we'd get here," Maya admitted, her gloved hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. "That first day when he could barely stand." Daniel nodded, understanding her unfinished thought. "It's always a miracle, isn't it? No matter how many times I've seen it, the resilience they show when given a chance." Their conversation drifted to practical matters, Phoenix's ongoing training schedule, the upcoming visit from Dr. Wyatt, Maya's plans to incorporate his rehabilitation case study into her veterinary technician final project, the ordinary details of a life that had found its rhythm, no longer overshadowed by the specter of Harrington's threats. When Ethan and Phoenix completed their circuit of the pasture and returned to the fence, both were relaxed, connected in that wordless understanding that develops between horse and rider over countless hours together. "He's looking for a job," Daniel observed, noting how Phoenix perked up when Ethan shifted in the saddle, ready for more challenges. Ethan patted the horse's neck, warmth spreading through him despite the December chill. "We've got time," he said simply. "All the time he needs." And that was the gift they had fought for. Not just Phoenix's physical recovery, but the luxury of time to heal completely, to build trust, to rediscover joy. The horse that no one had wanted, that had been discarded and forgotten, had found not just a second chance but a permanent home. As if sensing Ethan's thoughts, Phoenix turned his head, nudging Ethan's boot with his muzzle in the affectionate gesture that had become his trademark. Ethan leaned down to stroke his forehead, the simple touch and affirmation of their journey together. "We made it, buddy," he murmured, for Phoenix's ears alone. "We made it." In the distance, the winter sun glinted off the white fences of Daniel's farm, casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground. Within those boundaries, a horse that had once stood abandoned and broken now moved with confidence and trust, his recovery a testament to the power of patience, kindness, and the unwavering belief that every living being deserves a chance to heal. For Phoenix and Ethan, that chance had become something more, a bond forged in adversity, strengthened through challenges, and now settled into the quiet certainty that neither would ever again have to face the world alone.